Hello, my name is Chantal Stevens. I'm with Solar Washington, and I am happy to welcome you today to this webinar, the Home, Homeowner's Guide to Going Solar, Part 4, What Happens Next. Very quickly, Solar Washington is an independent, education-based nonprofit organization for anyone interested in solar. Our work, though independent, is only possible because of the support of our sponsors and members, and we are grateful for that support. We would like to invite you to get involved and support our vision of a 100% clean energy Washington. You can do that by joining as a member or sponsor, donating to our work, and register to and for attending the 2024 Solar Summit, which will happen October 4 in Shoreline, Washington. Today's presenter will again be Deborah Haffner-Ratliffe, who continues to bring a remarkable knowledge and experience acquired while working as a solar installer, being a founding member and the legislative and policy chair of WASEA, working for various state departments on issues as varied as low-income housing, electric vehicle, and solar and energy efficiency, and utility-scale renewable energy. And finally, in addition to serving on the Solar Washington board, thank you, Deborah, working in government affairs for a public utility district and running a consulting company that helps people and organizations navigate solar. Now, Deborah, let's do the transition.
All right.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 4, What Happens Next of the Homeowner's Guide to Going Solar. We have one more webinar that will be hosted by a different board member on Tuesday that'll be focusing on electrification. So this will be my last time presenting in this series. Today, we're going to go over a quick recap of what we talked about in parts 1 through 3, just to give you a quick reminder. We're going to talk about the milestones and timelines of having a solar project installed on your home, as well as the permitting and net metering or interconnection requirements and processes. Then we'll talk about what operations and maintenance looks like, what to expect the first year and steps you might need to be aware of. And then we'll talk about what if there's an issue with your new installation or later down the road. And then we'll also talk about what to do if you decide to sell your home that has a solar installation on it. So first, the quick recap of part 1. In that presentation that you can watch the recording of on our website, we talked about the different components of the solar installation and the functions they serve, the types of solar installations, roof versus ground mount, chicken coop was one of the examples we shared. We also talked about different roof materials and the considerations for how to install on different roof types. And then we talked about what impacts energy production, the primary 3 being location, direction, and shade. And then we talked about how to calculate potential system size, cost, and energy savings based on publicly available data for your situation, and alternatives if solar on your home isn't the right choice for you, that there's options like community solar and green power programs. And then we also briefly touched on the rules for homeowners associations requiring or being required to allow solar in Washington state. Then during part 2, we focused on the incentives that are available for Washington state residents, as well as the various types of loans and lending options for solar installations. So as a reminder, there's a 30% federal tax credit, there's a sales tax exemption, there's net metering, which is the crediting program through your utility, and then there's other incentives and policies available that we shared a link for how to find those in a university database. And then we talked about the various types of financing, whether you want to pay cash or get a loan, what you want to use for the collateral on the loan, and then some of the less common types of lending options that we don't see as much in Washington state, like leases and PPAs. And then we also talked about the common loan terms, what to be aware of, and some of the lending practices that are being more closely scrutinized. And then in part 3, we talked about how to get a solar estimate, what the timeline and process for a solar estimate looks like, and then the importance of a site survey or a site visit. We also talked about how to review a solar estimate, like reviewing the company itself, as well as understanding the data they're presenting to you, and then how to compare solar estimates, as well as a brief overview of contract terms. So today we're going to pick up where we left off, which was essentially getting to the point where you were ready to sign a contract. So as a quick recap, during part 3, we went over the steps for getting a site assessment, a solar quote, and getting to the point where you were comfortable to sign a contract. Again, those steps are talking to a company, getting a site assessment, getting a quote, reviewing the quote, checking out the company, researching the company, doing all the things you need to do to make sure you're ready to move forward and comfortable moving forward with a pretty large investment in contract. So once you have that contract signed, you now, under the State Consumer Protection Act for solar, the installer cannot require a down payment for a minimum of 3 days after signing the contract. That is because under federal law, if you sign a contract for something like solar, you legally have 3 days to cancel penalty free. So if you change your mind, if you realize that it wasn't what you thought you were signing, whatever the situation is, you have 3 days to cancel, and that should be explained in the contract itself and the steps for canceling the contract. But many installers do require a down payment. The size can vary. So there's typically advice when it comes to contractors where you're not supposed to give too much money up front. But a lot of solar installers are purchasing panels and equipment specific for your project, and so they might ask for a different ratio of down payment. Just make sure you understand what that is and you're comfortable with it. The other thing is, if you're going through a financing program, as soon as your loan issues a payment to that installer, whether the project's done or not, chances are it'll trigger your payment schedule. So if you make that down payment from your loan, you might immediately start having to pay loan payments, even if it takes another, let's say, 6 months to have the installation completed. So that's something to be aware of. So once everything is signed and ready to go, the steps that the installer will need to take are getting utility approval for interconnection or net metering and getting the project permitted. And then they'll do a bunch of behind the scenes work to plan the project, to finalize the design, the specs, assign their crews, make sure they've got all the materials, things like that. But under the new Consumer Protection Act for solar, you have to have that utility interconnection agreement approved by the utility before you can start construction. So that allows there to be a little bit more of a communication process that happens between you and your utility. And also it ensures that the original installation plan matches what the utility requires, because every utility has a little bit different requirement based on their policies and practices. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit more about what that utility net metering approval process looks like and the permitting process. And then there's construction. So some installers, every installer really does this differently. Some come in with a fairly large crew and they get the whole system installed in just a couple of days. Others will do one part of it one day and maybe come back the next week and do the next part. It just depends on how they have their crews broken up and assigned. But in general, to do a solar installation, in Washington State, things like the mounting system, just the rails that hold the solar panels onto your roof, are considered general construction. But the installation of the solar panels, the wiring, all of that is electrical. So you have to have a Journey electrical worker on site, and most employees hold electrical trainee or apprenticeship cards in Washington. So if you have any questions about the qualifications or people on the job site, that's one of the things you can ask them is, who's the Journey person, who's the Journey level electrician that's overseeing everything. Once the installation is done, the company requests an inspection. And then once that inspection is completed and everything passes, the utility is notified, and then the utility goes through their processes for interconnection. I'll talk about this more later, but it's important to note that if inspection is delayed, or if there's a change or anything like that, the utility cannot interconnect and energize the system until inspections are passed. and the system is not operational. You're not getting any benefit from the system until that utility interconnection is completed. So for that reason, I usually suggest don't make final payment until after the utility interconnection is completed. I've seen some installers where as soon as the work's done, they'll ask you to sign off and that gets them final payment. Or once it passes inspection, they'll ask you to sign off and that gets some final payment. But really the system's not doing anything until that utility piece is completed. So permitting. In Washington State, solar is considered electrical, which always requires a permit. The statewide agency for electrical permits is the Department of Labor and Industries. I think last time I checked, they cost $100-ish, maybe a little bit more for a solar, for the type of electrical permit that covers solar. But there are some local jurisdictions that do their own electrical permitting at the city level. I believe there's a link that Chantal will be sharing to some resources about these things. But if you're doing an installation yourself, for example, you still need to get an electrical permit. There are rules and methods for doing that. Otherwise, the utility can't interconnect it. If your installer's talking about how expensive permits are, you can always go yourself and double check exactly what those costs are. But you do need to make sure that things are permitted properly. The permit for electrical should be pulled by the company doing the work. So if you have a company that's subcontracting the electrical work, the company that's doing the work, the subcontractor, is who's supposed to pull the permit. Especially with Department of Labor and Industries, but as well as with many jurisdictions, it's really easy to go online, put in your address and look up the permit. You can look up the status of the permit. You can look up if there's been any comments made on the permit. You can look up when the permit was filed. You can look at which company pulled the permit. So just as a homeowner, it's a good thing to often keep track of that permit and to know, as well as if there are any issues down the line, you can have access to that permit, like if you're going to sell your home and there are any questions. Sometimes building permits are required. Those are typically done at the county or city level, and it really just depends on the jurisdiction. Some counties don't require it, some cities don't require it, but others do. So not only is it important to make sure that you're working with an installer that knows the rules in your area, you might also want to double check on the rules yourself to make sure everything is in compliance. I think when it comes to permits, building permits are the easiest maybe to overlook, I'll say. They're not always skipped or anything like that. It's just, it's not as black and white as an electrical permit as to whether or not one is required. The other thing that I'm mentioning here under permitting, because this is regulated by the Department of Labor and Industries, is prevailing wages. So if you have a project that is in any way funded with public dollars, state or federal, they have both state and federal rules about overtime pay, about minimum wages based on what work is being performed that is specifically tied to having that public funding. So if you are going through, let's say, the upcoming Solar for All funding program, or maybe you got a grant from the USDA because you have a farm, that's something to be aware of as well, and to make sure that you're working with an installer who's prepared for that and comfortable with that. For you, the homeowner, there really isn't a lot you have to do. It's just the installer has to make sure they're in compliance with not just the wage requirements and the overtime requirements, but also there's reporting forms they have to fill out and things like that. So that is also regulated by L&I for Washington State, and they can often help with the federal requirements as well. But again, if you're getting any public funding specific for your project, make sure you understand what the rules are there. Interconnection application, net metering, interconnection, they're all used interchangeably, but the interconnection application is what you fill out in order to get the utility's approval to connect your system that could potentially backfeed the grid. This is really important because if it's done incorrectly and there's a power outage and that solar continues to produce energy without going into a battery bank or in a way that feeds the grid, that can actually endanger the line workers who are trying to restore power. And things like that. So it's important to have that step completed, and it's also how you qualify for net metering or whatever credits are available at your utility. So again, each utility is different. Some utilities require production meters, which keep track of all of the energy the system produces, whether you use it or not. Others don't. They can have different requirements for the documents that they want to receive. They can have different timelines for processing. So it's important to make sure that you have an installer who, even if they haven't worked with your utility before, does their due diligence to learn what the rules and requirements for your utility are. In the interconnection application, or as part of it, there is an interconnection agreement that, as part of the application, you usually sign. This gets interesting because for the purposes of the contract, you, the customer, are who has a contractual relationship with the utility. The utility doesn't typically have a contractual relationship with the solar installer. So you're signing an agreement that basically says, we promise we're going to do a bunch of these things, but it's the installer who actually goes through and does that work and who knows what those various technical terms mean and who are responsible for making sure that system is in compliance. So if you have an issue or a question or you don't understand something in that application document, chances are it might really be relevant to the installer. However, because you are who has the contractual relationship with the utility, when it comes down to it, the utility really can't do a lot to hold the contractor responsible, which again is why it's really important to understand what is in your contract with the installer, because the flow of who's responsible for what with relation to which agreement really matters sometimes. So I would say one thing is to make sure that the contract from your installer says that they will follow the utility policies in their interconnection application. And now there's actually part of the law under the Solar Consumer Protection Act in Washington State is that that interconnection application has to be provided to you at the same time you sign your solar contract. So it's not something where after you sign the solar contract, weeks later, you learn that there's a policy or a procedure or a crediting mechanism that you weren't aware of. So make sure that's included with your application, and that can also just be a hyperlink to the page. I will say call your utility if you have questions. A lot of times, even though the relationship contractually is between you and your utility, a lot of times the installer does most of the communicating with the utility about timelines and work and things like that. And unfortunately, I have seen some installers who kind of play, I've heard it called mom versus dad. You know, if mom says no, go ask dad kind of thing, where they will tell you that it's a utility issue. The utility is causing the delay. The utility is the one making things difficult. The utility is why you haven't gotten your installation done quicker, when it's not always the case. So if you have questions about the net metering policies or the timelines or anything like that, the best thing to do is often just call your utility and find out what's going on their end, what their policies are, so that you're getting it directly from the utility. As I mentioned earlier, now there's a requirement that the interconnection application must be approved by the utility before construction can start. Not doing so is considered a violation of the Consumer Protection Act in Washington now. So if there's an issue where your installer starts the project and then the utility says, hey, wait a minute, you're installing this in a way that doesn't align with our rules, here's our edits, our changes to your application, that installer is supposed to have already gotten that approval before they began the work. And then the other thing is it does take time for utilities to process. Most utilities interconnection applications are just another form that they get, such as a new construction permit or a new service, like if someone's building a shop and they want to put a separate meter on it. So you go through that same process with most utilities and you end up in a queue. It can take, the average I've seen is about 3 weeks, but there are some utilities where I know it can take about 5 weeks to process those. So just be aware that the sooner the installer can get that submitted to the utility, the sooner they can start construction and the sooner the process can move forward. And the reason that takes time is because they usually have an engineer review it to make sure it's in compliance with their requirements, that there aren't any safety concerns, things like that. So just something to be aware of. And then the other thing is under the new Consumer Protection Act, there is a specific rule that says it's the contractor's responsibility to follow, adjust, and communicate any changes to the utility. So if the utility says we require a production meter, it's the installer's job to make sure they install that production meter. If the utility says, hey, we really need you to make a change here, this is supposed to be on this part of the accessible building, the installer is required to make that change. And then the other thing is if there are any changes initiated by you or the installer, it's the installer's responsibility to communicate those to the utility. because, for example, the net metering or interconnection application specifies what type of panels are being installed. And so if they say, hey, we couldn't get those panels, we're going to put these different panels on there, the utility still needs to be notified, because that changes how things work with the grid. So it's an important part of the process, and it also, I expect, will change what the change order process looks like a little bit. So if a utility comes back and says, no, you were supposed to do that, I think the hope is that there will be fewer change orders, because it's something the installer should have done from the beginning. So operations, your system, again, is not operational until it's interconnected with the utility. And if there are any issues or anything with the production, you're most likely to find that out after the system is turned on. So that's an important milestone to keep track of. And I would check your contract and really try to make it so that the final payment is not due until after the system is operational with the utility. I've seen some examples of installers where they do the install, they get paid, and then even months later, it's not interconnected with the utility. And the reason is the utility needed a change and the installer never communicated with them, never got it fixed, isn't returning phone calls. So that payment can be a bit of an extra carrot to make sure everything gets done properly. Once everything is installed and it's interconnected with the utility, it should operate automatically. It'll just start producing energy. Your net meter will start keeping track of it. Your home won't know a difference, because it'll pull the electricity that is closest to it. So it'll pull from the solar first. And if the solar isn't producing enough, it'll pull from the grid. And then your net meter keeps track of all of that. But you can check production yourself. So if you want to double check that your system's operating the way they said it would, or there's some people who just like tracking it. Like, some people really like Excel spreadsheets. I am one of them. There are ways that you can get that data. So one is a production meter. Some utilities still require it, not all, but you always have the option of adding it yourself. It just might add to the cost slightly, $500 maybe. Some inverters also keep track for you. So there'll be a readout that's like, what's it producing right now? What's it produced over the lifetime? It just depends on the inverter, and you can have different screens that provide different data on those inverters. And then there's also apps. Lots of people are getting apps that show what their solar is producing. I've seen one where it even shows which solar panels are producing, because it's tied to a microinverter. And so it can see the data for each individual solar panel, which is pretty cool. But so again, should operate automatically, but there's ways to watch it and track it if you're interested in that. And then the other thing is battery backup. If you have battery backup, those usually are automatic. Sometimes there can be a switch required, like there is with a generator. But the big thing with battery backup is if you have a power outage, sometimes you don't even notice, because your house just starts drawing the power. So it's important to try and keep an eye on, oh, there might be a power outage, so that you can go and adjust which parts of your home are drawing power so that you can prioritize. You might want to unplug a freezer for a few hours a day. You might want to turn the heat down, things to help expand the lifespan of those batteries. I think there might be ways to program that in and make it a little bit more automatic now, but the point is you might need to do some manual steps if you're in an outage situation and you want to expand the life of that battery backup during the outage. Maintenance. So maintenance is a big question with solar panels that often comes up. I have seen companies try and sell maintenance packages for thousands of dollars in some cases. But really the big thing with solar panels is cleaning. In Washington State, especially Western Washington, you probably want to wash your panels a minimum of once per year. And that's because the debris, the dust, the pollen, whatever it is that builds up on it, can slow down the energy production. It acts as a little bit of a block, a little bit of a shade. But also, you don't want too much grime building up, moss can grow, things like that. So you can wash them yourselves. What I've typically heard is you use a soft brush, like a car wash brush, or a microfiber mop or something like that, and a really mild soap. I believe dishwasher soap is an option, but talk to your installer, talk to the manufacturer potentially. And then you're going to want to make sure you do not walk or step on the panels. And there are companies that offer this as a service. You can hire them. I think there are even some companies, I don't know if there are any in Washington. I know there are in California, where all they do is wash solar panels. That's their business model. I know some installers where, as part of buying solar from them, they offer a 1-year cleaning, and as part of that is for them to check on everything and make sure it's doing what it should be doing and that there aren't any loose wires or things to clean up. And then the other thing with cleaning is it's not just the surface of the panel. If you've got leaves building up underneath or spider webs or things like that, it's an opportunity to, what I've heard people do is take a leaf blower onto the roof and just blow out anything that's between the solar panels and the roof. The other thing is vegetation management. This comes up the most on ground-mounted solar arrays. So, you don't want vegetation growing up and around the solar panels or blackberry vines or anything like that, both because it can damage the panels and the system, but also because it can block if there's a shading issue. But there's also vegetation management potentially for a roof-mounted installation. Like if you've got a tree that was shorter than your house when the solar was installed and it's growing, you might want to prune that back. You might want to make sure that that pretty rose trellis growing up the side of the house isn't getting to the point where it might grow up the solar panels, things like that. And then there are some standard lifespan replacements. A big one is an inverter. An inverter typically lasts 10 to 15 years. So if you've got a system that's been installed that long, there's a chance you're going to have to just update that inverter and that it'll be past the warranty period. It's going to be a fraction of the cost of what the whole system was, because at that point, all you're doing is paying for a new inverter and someone to uninstall the old one and install the new one. There can be other components that might fail throughout the life of the solar panels. That can include everything from a piece of plastic getting dried out and cracking to tracking app that you're using might be out of date. So just keep an eye on how things are working, and remember that the longest warranty is the production warranty. And so if someone says the system has a 30-year warranty, that's typically just the production. Other parts of the system will have a shorter warranty that you'll need to be aware of as well. So the first year, energy savings can get kind of complicated. If we assume just a standard net metered utility, what often happens when someone gets an install that goes live, let's say between October and March, is you don't see any impact on your utility bill. Because if you look at the blue bars, the highest energy production for solar is in the summer. But in the Northwest, the majority of our energy consumption is during the winter. And so with the net metering program, the way it'll work on a full annual basis is during the summer months, you'll build up credits that'll then be applied to your winter bills when you have less solar. However, if you get your solar installed October, November, you're probably not going to see a huge difference depending on your heat, depending on your installation, because you're going to have less solar production and a higher energy bill. So really the best way to know if your system is producing the way that you were told it is produced is to look at the first year cycle between April and March. So you can always call your utility, you can always call your installer, but just be prepared. If you get a winter installation, it's not going to automatically have the same impact as an installation that went live in the summer. And then during the first year, you're also going to want to potentially file for the tax credit if you're eligible. You can review Part 2 for more information on it, but you just file it as part of your normal annual federal taxes. And I believe Chantal is going to share a link to the form. It's now required that solar installers provide a copy of the form with their contract for you so that you have access to it and you know what it looks like. But you just file it as part of your normal taxes as if you were taking a credit for your mortgage insurance or anything else. And it's a form that many of the online filing apps have an option for now. But if you work with an accountant or you file yourself longhand, the form is easy to find. You just find the right form for the right year, and the information is things like, how much did your solar installation cost? Does your home qualify for the tax credit? Things like that, and then it gets added into the overall tax liability. And if you review Part 2, we'll go over what qualifies and how the tax credit works, what to watch for, some examples. One big one, as a reminder, is some loans require you apply your federal tax credit value to the loan in order to not have your payment go up. Other considerations, other considerations during the first year. One is property taxes. So in most areas, property taxes are based on the value of your home, and sometimes that can be based on what is reported during a permit for work. So if there is an installer filling out a permit for you and they say the value of the system is $15,000 when you actually paid $10,000, I don't know why they would do that, but just as an example, it can impact your property taxes. And it's also part of why it's important to make sure you're paying a fair amount for solar, because you can have consequences of overpaying, like having the property taxes evaluated higher than the actual value of the solar. The other thing is homeowners insurance. Oh, and I'll add, some areas, I don't know any off the top of my head, but some areas don't include renewable energy as part of the valuation for property taxes. You'll just have to see what the rules are in your area. And then homeowners insurance is another one. I've heard homeowners insurance rates go up maybe about $100 a year with a solar installation. And that's supposed to help protect from things that aren't covered by warranty, tree branch falling on them, things like that. But it's usually important to add them to your homeowners insurance because they become part of the home that is covered. And then what to do if there's an issue. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can have your solar installed and then realize something's not quite right. They can get damaged. Like I said, a tree branch falling. I've heard of a lawnmower throwing a rock and it causing a little crack, things like that. In some cases, the panels will keep producing. It's not worth doing the fix. The cracked glass will still let enough sunlight through. In other cases, you might have a homeowner's insurance claim. And depending on what the issue is, it might be a warranty claim. Most panels are warranted for 10 years by the manufacturer, just that they were built properly. And then your solar installer will also likely have a warranty for the work they performed. So if your roof starts leaking or anything like that, it could be that there's a warranty issue. The other thing is a production issue. So if the system isn't producing what you were told it was going to produce, in most cases, that's either going to be an issue with how the installation was designed, or there's a chance that there is an issue with one of the panels. In most situations that I have seen, it is actually a problem with what the installer designed and what they promised you it would do. So you can often go reach out to a different installer and say, hey, I have the system, can you verify what they told me, how it's producing, things like that. And then you'll have another opinion. Sometimes the installer will come back and say like, yeah, this is weird, it should be producing more. Or yeah, there was no way the system was going to produce what you were promised. Then you can go back to the installer. If there's an issue with an actual panel or a piece of the equipment, that's a different issue that goes through the manufacturer. Most installers will help you navigate a manufacturer warranty. But what often happens is the installer and manufacturer just point at each other and say, no, this is your issue, this is your issue. There was one example I saw where the system was installed with a inverter that was only rated for half of the size of what the total solar installation was, and it shorted out and died. And the installer tried to say it was a manufacturer defect, and the manufacturer, I think, rightly said, no, you installed the wrong inverter for this system. So things like that can come up. The other thing is if there's an energy savings or utility bill issue, again, look at what the warranty is for your installation. What did they promise you in terms of, we promise it'll produce X amount. It could be that there's a production issue, which could be related to the installer's design, or if there's a manufacturer issue. And it could also just be a consumer protection issue if you had an installer that wasn't honest with you about what your system was going to produce. So there's some links that Chantal is going to share. So you can always report issues to regulatory agencies. Typically, the best thing to do is start by talking to the installer and documenting their response. Then potentially bring in another installer or solar expert to get a second opinion on what your system's doing and what it should be doing. And then if it turns out that it's an installation issue or design issue, you can go back to the solar installer. You can also escalate it to the Attorney General's office in Washington State or the Federal Trade Commission or L&I, depending on what the issue is. And then also if there's an issue with the loan, one thing that I've heard some people say is they didn't understand the loan terms, or the salesperson misinformed them about what was in the loan. So you can also report to like the Department of Financial Institutions. There's a lot of different ways to get help. And then you can also just go private to an attorney. There's been a few lawsuits and settlements against solar installers over the last few years. So you're not stuck. There's resources if you end up in a bad situation. And then selling a home with solar panels. So this is coming up more and more. There's, I think last time I looked, there were like 400 houses that had solar as one of the keywords listed in Washington State on Zillow. And in most cases, and sometimes during the sales process, the number that's used to assess the value that solar adds to your home is 4% of the installation cost. But that depends on a lot of things. It depends on the age of the system. It depends on the energy value in your area. It depends on the demand for solar in your area. It depends on the quality of the install. I saw one recently where it was a house for sale and the solar panels were just completely blocked by the tree out front. There was no way it was going to produce what they said it was. And then it can also impact the title and deed depending on how it's financed. So that can come up when you're looking at selling. The big thing to remember is that any solar installation that's already installed is basically worth 30% less than if someone was to buy that same installation new today. And that's because a new solar installation qualifies for the 30% federal tax credit and an existing installation doesn't. So when you sell your home to someone that has solar installed, if they bought a different home and installed the exact same system, you've got to think about what they would end up paying for it, not just the value of what you paid for it. And so Chantal is going to share a study from Forbes, I believe, about this. But 4%, again, is just average. It depends on the overall value of your home as well. If you've got a really, really small house, the solar could end up adding a little bit more value because of the proportionality of what your home is worth. Some people will say that the value of your home automatically goes up by 4%. Just things to bear in mind and to understand how those things are being taken into consideration in the estimates the installer has given you. If you're planning on living in your house for 40 years, any equity might not necessarily matter to you. But if you're going to go and sell your house in a few years, then you really probably want to pay attention to how they're evaluating that. So, oops, did I skip one? Nope, we're good. Okay. So what's next? Once you go solar, you might start noticing, I've noticed some people where they kind of get this challenge of how low can I get my electric bill? Can I get it to where I'm only paying the base fee? But at the same time, there's things you can do that'll increase your energy load, like getting an electric car or a hot tub, in which case the solar that you have installed might not fully cover it. So one thing to do is to think about what you really want to invest in first for your home. So on Tuesday, we're going to talk specifically about electrification, which will overall increase your energy consumption. But there's also things you can do to reduce your energy consumption. And again, that solar install is going to produce what that solar install is going to produce. It doesn't care how old your furnace is. It doesn't care how efficient your windows are. So the more energy efficient your home, the less energy your home uses, the less solar you need. The more electrified your home, the more electric vehicles you have, the more solar you need on the assumption you want to cancel out your bill. The other thing with weatherization is that depending on what programs you qualify for, going solar first might actually reduce your ability to get funding from weatherization programs. And that's because solar can reduce your bill in a way that credits, so it doesn't look like you're using as much energy as you might be. So if you want to do something like get new insulation or get new windows, it might actually behoove you to do that first. Considerations for things that people often think about when they're deciding what they want to do first, or thinking about, comfort, budget, how much they're going to save from those various programs or various improvements, and then what programs are available. Most utilities have weatherization and energy efficiency improvement assistance of some kind, rebates. I know one utility has like a $2 a square foot rebate for insulation. So it's usually good to start by talking to your utility and seeing what programs are out there, what funding looks like. And then there's a theory in debt management called snowballing, where you pay off a piece of debt and then you use the payment from that debt to start applying it to your next debt until you get rid of some of your debt. Well, you can do the same thing with energy. You can say, okay, we're going to install solar and we're going to use the energy savings or the federal tax credit to do the next piece of weatherization for our home or electrification for our home, or vice versa. You can install the windows and use whatever rebates you get from a program like that, or tax incentives you get from a program like that, and then apply them to your next energy efficiency or solar project. So it's usually a pretty personal choice in terms of how you want to prioritize and what you want to do. The other thing I was going to add earlier, so jumping back a little bit, is you can always add more solar. There's no rule that says you can't. What will happen is if you still have space available on your roof, and what programs are currently available, because you could end up in a situation where half of your system is grandfathered into net metering and half of your system isn't. So you just have to talk to your utility about what that looks like. But if you find yourself wanting to add more solar panels later, that's something you can do, and it usually costs less overall because that infrastructure for solar has already been installed. The inverter's already installed, the wiring's already installed. The other thing is if you find yourself in a situation where you don't want the solar panels, you can often fairly easily get rid of them in a way that allows them to be reused. I know people who have bought solar installs off Craigslist. There are some installers who say, yeah, we'd be happy to either remove them for free and do something with them or buy them from you. So don't feel like if you're in a situation, the example I'm thinking of is someone ended up in a bad situation with a foreclosure. And so they decided that solar was one of the things they were going to try and liquidate. So if you end up in a situation where you want to add more or they're no longer working for you, you have options. And electrification specifically will be talked about more during the next presentation. So I just want to say thank you again. This is my last time presenting, and I'm going to turn it over to Chantal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dever. Quick 2 questions because we're almost out of time, but I think those are very important questions. Is claiming 30% tax credits itself sufficient to trigger the prevailing wage requirements? Somebody wants to make sure that it doesn't do that.
No, that's a good question. The 30% federal tax credit does not trigger prevailing wage requirements. Prevailing wage requirements are typically triggered if there is a direct payment that says we're helping you pay for this system. The tax credit itself doesn't trigger it on the residential side. On the commercial side, it's a little different, but on the residential side, it does not.
Okay, thank you for that. If a solar installation that is interconnected to the grid does not include battery backup, will it nevertheless be able to provide daytime power during a grid blackout?
That is a really good question. The answer is no. So there are special inverters and there are special things you can do that allow for that to be activated. But in general, the answer is no, because the inverter is not programmed to recognize that. It's programmed to recognize there is an outage. We need to shut down and protect the grid. So be very sure you understand what you're getting from your installer and ask about options for those types of situations.
Okay, well, I was told that my voice echoes, which I knew it was. So again, thank you very much, Deborah, for all 4 of those workshops, webinars, that all of them were recorded. They're all available on the web. We have, you will receive a message in the next 24 hours that gives you a link to the recording as well as a link to the page on our website that includes all the past webinars and the copies of the links that we share into the chat box throughout the presentation. So again, thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you very much to all of you who have been with us now for 2 weeks. We appreciate your commitment. We hope that we have answered a lot of your questions, and we will answer some more next week when we talk about electrification, which is kind of the next step, could be a step before, but it's likely to be a next step in your journey toward a solar home. Thank you very much and have a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you, Deborah.